Hi, I'm Steve. I'm a data visualization expert by trade, and my hobby for the last decade has been analyzing and visualizing sports data. The chart I'm best known for regards wages in MLS, Major League Soccer, and I've been running it for almost that full decade. And I want to share some of my experiences with that, why I built it, and what I learned from it over the years, and address some questions that come up on Twitter when these things were released, as the latest release came from Major League Soccer Players Union just a couple days ago. So let's take a look at it. I've organized this as a stacked bar tree map, is what I'm calling it. And I've done that for a couple of reasons. One, a standard tree map is generally just taking up the full space, and then it's just a large rectangle with a bunch of smaller rectangles inside of it. You could do this visual that way, but then you'd have to figure out which little segment is which individual team. I like this stacked bar approach more because you can very quickly read it as a stacked bar when just comparing team payrolls, but then you can look at all this conglomeration of rectangles within any individual bar and get a sense for the distribution of different salary sizes on that particular team. So, for example, with Atlanta here, we have 4 players making over $2 million, and then down at the other end of the roster, you've got guys making only $66,000, the league minimum. And if I did this as a normal stacked bar, you might not even see the 66,000 guys, because they're so much smaller than everybody else, they might not even get a pixel when trying to render this on the screen. It's also got a little more interesting look to it than a standard stack bar, which people see all the time. And so we can scroll down and see that we've got Real Salt Lake at the bottom here, and their overall wages are almost exactly half of Atlanta, 10.5 million. And some of the comments on Twitter were, wow, look at how cheap all these other teams are. Well, let's go back in time and see how that compares to just a couple years ago. So, 2018. Toronto FC was paying a lot more than the others. And this is one weakness of going from year to year, is it all scales based on that largest one. But 26.6 million, big drop off. And then Houston is paying a fifth of that, roughly. That's a very different dynamic than what we're seeing right now, and that's just a couple years back. You see the same thing in 2016, basically. Although we had more of a top 3 than just one big outlier. Let's go back a little further. 2013. Still, 3 big spenders, and nobody else really. And you've got the 4th place team at half of what the top spenders is spending. Again, the most recent one, it's last place that's got half the payroll. Let's go back a little further, 2010. Now we're in an entirely different paradigm. You got one team spending $15.7 million, Red Bull New York, when they had Thierry Henry and Rafa Marquez. Marquez didn't really perform very well for that money. LA Galaxy with Beckham, and Beckham was making, on his own, more than every other non-Red Bull New York team in the league. Back to the very first year we had the salary releases, 2007. Beckham's the only hugely paid player, and again, he's paid more than everybody in the league. Also, look at the details. He had teammates making $13,000 while he raked in $6.5 million, and that's not including his endorsements. Some people summarized this era of MLS as you'd call the league Major League Soccer, but a large portion of the roster was really the minor leagues, who would just come off of the bench into a major league game. This league has changed immensely in a decade and a half, and I think that these charts make that clear. Another way I've looked at the evolution of these things is through this view, where you can choose an individual team. They get a colored line chart with their logo on the end, and everybody else is in gray. Miami came in, started spending pretty quickly. They really haven't gotten good results from it. But let's look at a team that's been around a little longer, New England Revolution. They've been near the league median, median being the middle of the distribution. So if you were looking at that ranking of the payrolls, the median is that team right around the middle. So they've been near, sometimes above, sometimes below the median wage for the league throughout their history. And then suddenly this year, boom, they open up the pocketbooks. Let's look at another one. FC Dallas has been, again, kind of tracking with the median. This year they're above. A few years here they were below. But they've just kind of ramped up with the league. Chivas USA, who you saw towards the bottom of some of those tree maps as we went through history. They were spending very low relative to everyone else, and then they folded. Another approach you can take on this dashboard, and I'll have the links to all these dashboards in the comments down below so you can explore them on your own, is you click a line chart and you can see that team. So there's LA Galaxy again, always spending well above the median. The most consistent club to do so. Colorado kind of tracking with the median, falling below it the last few years. But a recurrent comment when these charts are released is, yeah, but compare that to the league table. And I have. I've got a dashboard here in which salaries relative to the league median are tracked along the x-axis, and points per game are tracked along the y-axis. And I've separated this into segments and also run a regression analysis on it. And essentially, this is random distribution. It's not to say that spending is wholly irrelevant, but it is to say that if you were to try to explain results in MLS, you probably shouldn't put a lot of emphasis on trying to talk about payrolls. There's just not a one-to-one relationship here that you can reliably look at wages alone. Some writers that pay a lot more attention to the league than I do, and certainly much more attention to the league than most people, have long said spending smart is much more important than spending big. And that's a big differentiator for MLS versus almost every other football league in the world. You go to Europe, and it's almost always the big spending clubs at the top of the table, the low spending clubs trying to fend off relegation. Every now and then you get, a big Leicester underdog, and it's a fantastic story, but they're the exception, not the rule. Another little nuance we've got in this chart is all the title winners have got a star. Everybody that didn't win a title in that year are circles. And you've got a lot of titles won in this top left corner where there's low wages and good results. There's even Real Salt Lake, who had kind of middling results, but had a great run in the playoffs and got an MLS Cup. And then if you're going to try to point to these stars in the top right, you can't just ignore the dots in the bottom right who didn't even make the playoffs. Now, there's some nuances in here you want to be aware of. The bottom axis is a log scale based on their salaries relative to the median. Why did I do that? Well, I had to do with salaries relative to the median because there's been such inflation in MLS over the years. If I didn't, then these early LA Galaxy seasons would look like they were low spending because that $9 million would be below the lowest payroll right now. So we're ranking this based on spending relative to the median. And then if I hadn't done a log scale and done a standard scale of that axis, you see that bottom of the tooltip there, everything would be crunched in around that median because that's the way this often lays out, is you get a lot of teams near the median value. And so I'm spreading them out with the log scale so you can actually see more of the data points. And then why is the y-axis points per game? Well, not all MLS seasons have the same number of games. Thank you, COVID. And so you have to normalize the data to have something useful there. There's also a feature where you can look at individual seasons and highlight those data points. Again, just about every season, you've got low spenders that do well, big spenders that fail, and somebody lands in all 9 of these segments just about every time. Be another way to look at the history of a club. We could look at Houston, see they've never been in that top spending area, but there's also not much of a relationship between how much they spent and how well they did, although one of their biggest spending years was the one in which they got an MLS Cup, but it still was essentially league median wages. Columbus, pretty close to the same story. Again, I've got the links to this in the comments, and I'd love for you to explore this on your own. Leave a comment in this video or reach out to me on Twitter. It's @StatHunting, as you'll see in the bottom of most of my visualizations. And I'll see those comments probably faster than YouTube comments. But let's take a look at some of the questions that have routinely come to me from the from Twitter in the last couple days, and talk about that. There's a comment here: would love to see an animated graphic showing each team's roster value over history. So this one is the one that's designed to really show the history. It's not animated. I might dig in at some point and make a tree map that animates. It comes out looking pretty funky because like all those individual rectangles resize and then resort themselves to which team they're supposed to be on. It'll look a little chaotic, but I'll see if I can pull that off. It's going to require me digging in on some Tableau calculations to make that happen. Most of this is already talking about many of the things that I already mentioned. There was an interesting comment from Sounders Navia, who wanted me to point out, wanted me to look at what would happen in my main chart if I resorted everything to have the lowest wages on the left. So I got a basic version of that I mocked up, and it's kind of an interesting alternate way to look at this. You can see pretty clearly those gray areas are very close to each other. And you've got some that spend a lot less on the lower end, but most of the differences between clubs is how much they spend on the millionaires, and that comes down to in most part to Major League Soccer's salary cap, in which you can have 3 designated players, they call them, where the owners can pay whatever they want, and a designated percentage of the salary cap is going to be hit by that player, but not nearly as much as they're being paid. And so going over and above for these multi-millionaires is the biggest way they can get around the salary cap and pump up those numbers so high. And so that's where most of the differences are going to be. It's also kind of interesting to look at it here in terms of those 500,000 to 1 million players. And at least early in this season, it does seem like a lot of the teams that are doing really well are spending a lot of their money in that range, which does make some sense. Some people say soccer is an O-ring competition, where the weakest link on the field is going to cost you more than the strongest link is going to help you. Because by the nature of the game, it's a big field, and strategically the opposing team can find a bad player and exploit him. Whereas if the best player is up against good defenders, he's going to have a harder time time doing something spectacular every single time out there. And there are exceptions. If Messi comes to MLS, he'll probably rip through things. But if a team brings him in and still has cheap defenders on the roster that can't keep up, it's going to end up being very high scoring on both ends, and his team might not be as good as you would expect. So thank you to Sounders Navi for the question that prompted that little revisualization of things. Another trend that I looked at was the IQR. The interquartile range is the middle 50% of players. So we're looking at this bottom line here represents how much is being paid to the player that is about 1/4 up when you'd be ranking all the players' salaries. And it's not that far above the league minimum in most years. And it's gotten about 5 times higher, $17,000 up to 89.5. And then up here, you've got the 75th percentile. So you go down 1/4 when ranking all the player wages. So that top quarter of the league started at 115,000 back in 2007. Now it's 570,000. Again, about 5 times. The median, the right middle of player salaries. Right now it's just under 250,000. Back in the day, just over 50,000. Once again, it's increased 5 times. So throughout this middle range, there's a couple weird little jumps here and there, which you'll see sometimes in distributions, but it's kind of remarkably steady how it's grown and then exploded in the last few years. Let's look at a couple other questions real fast. This was an interesting one, and I think it's worth thinking about, but also rebutting. Now, can you shame the wealthy owners who are leeching their fan bases? Like or hate Arthur Blank, who's the owner of the Atlanta club. He's trying to push MLS forward. These other owners are leeches. They need to look at themselves when their TV deals come in at half to third of expectations. Side note, they're negotiating a new TV deal right now, and they are for the first time uncoupled from U.S. soccer. So previous TV deals, they weren't actually getting all the money. They were a lot of the money went to U.S. men's national team, U.S. women's national team. Now MLS has to stand on their own and make a TV deal. And yeah, it's probably going to come in lower than they were hoping, but all the money is actually going to come in to them. So I do want to clarify, this is not all spending. This is just payrolls. So it doesn't take into account transfer fees. We don't have one holistic data source on that. It doesn't take into account how much they're spending on facilities, academies, which is a vital part of this, bringing in younger players, training them. And we're seeing a lot of clubs getting some very good players from their own academy. Their staff, coaching, scouts, etc. Analysts, hopefully, in many cases. None of that shows up in these numbers. So this isn't total spending. But saying the other clubs are leeches, one, I think this person probably knew they were being a bit hyperbolic. But these other clubs are ramping up their spending. Again, just a couple years ago. Let's go 6 years back. Top spending was the same, $21.5 million. Low spending was one-fifth of that. It's a very different league than it was just a little while ago. And a large part of that is everyone's being, particularly further down the payroll list, is being more aggressive in their spending. Do I think some of them could be more aggressive? Sure, but it also comes back to, if spending alone isn't going to get you results, you don't just throw money at a problem and think that's going to be useful. Let's see, what else do we have in here? There are a few comments talking about comparing this to NWSL, the Women's League, or USL, the next step down on the U.S. soccer pyramid. And we don't have overall data on that. There is this Portland Stems made some good points, but the reality is we kind of know the min, know the max. We can get a general sense of some of it, but none of these leagues release the wages for every player the way that MLS does. But yeah, these guys are paid a lot more than the women, and they're paid a lot more than the teams further down. But we don't have exact data to really track that. Got some folks kind of doing their own look at, are they getting what they should have? And again, I'm going into a little more detail than him on that. And I'm not including partial seasons in here because there's always outliers 1/3 through the season where we're at right now that, if we look back at the end of the season, we'll say, oh, wait, that team was not nearly as good as their record indicated. I think the league table lies a bit at this point of the season. A lot of people commenting on how big money injured or loaned out. Yeah, that's kind of an inherent problem with spending big on one or two players. If they're not producing, either through injury or, sometimes getting old, lack of motivation, sometimes these bigger salaries are going to, especially back in the day, we're going to Europeans in their mid to late 30s. They didn't want to run around in the Texas heat on a road game. And yeah, you tie up that much of your club's resources. It's really more about marketing in some of these cases than it really is about expecting them to produce. And you have to recognize that when looking at it. I think I've captured the tenor of most of these comments. If you commented on one of these charts and did not see a reply in this video or on Twitter from me, please reach out on Twitter again or comment here. And I'd love to talk about it further. I've been diving into these data for a decade, so I think I know what I'm talking about, but there's lots of other nuances in there, and I love to talk about it. This video was brought to you by Action Analytics. My boss here, Keith, is in my comments with some of our marketing material. And we are data visualization experts who provide a lot of value to our clients. And we love to work with really talented people. We have Tableau visionaries, formerly known as Zen Masters, on our staff. We have Alteryx aces. We do lots of great work with great clients, and we'd love to have more clients talk to us and more great people talk to us about joining the team. I used to run my own sole prop Tableau consultancy, and I did well, but I joined Action Analytics because there were great people to work with, and they run the business side while I just get to do what I do. And if you're in that situation, I highly, highly recommend we have a conversation. My DMs are open on Twitter. Reach out, or you can book a chat on actionanalytics.com/careers. Got that book a chat button on a lot of places of this website. Also hit the button if you think that our services could be of use to you. We'd love to have a conversation. Anyway, I've been in these data for such a long time. I'd love to have further conversations with anybody. There's lots of other nuances that can't make it in. So they release these data tables, and sometimes extensions on contracts are announced publicly right around the same time, but it's not under the deadline for the data. So Nashville, we got Chris Ivey here, follows them really closely, knows that big contract extensions came to two of their players, so they're probably ranked a lot lower on this list than they actually are in reality at the moment. And another table will generally come out in the early fall, and I'll have other conversations with folks at that time. But I hope you've learned some things. If there's requests, I could also create a how-to video on these charts. But let's have further conversation, and you folks have a great day.